He had exactly 7 minutes left, and everything he loved was riding on it. No mother to call. No backup plan. Just him, and a little girl burning up with fever in that room. 7 minutes wasn't a delay. It was a death sentence. He had a reason. She never asked for one. He thought he'd lost everything. He had no idea who was about to change it all. The rain hit the glass tower of Ashcroft Global like 1,000 tiny fists, and inside, on the 32nd floor, Daniel Reyes was running, not walking fast, running. His tie was crooked. His shoes were soaked through from the puddle he'd sprinted across on Fifth Avenue, and in his left hand he clutched a crumpled piece of paper with a phone number scrawled on it in a child's handwriting. If you've ever had one morning where everything that could go wrong did go wrong, all at once, like the universe was testing exactly how much you could carry before you broke, then you already know how this story begins. And if you want to see how far one father's love can go before it either destroys him or saves him, stay until the end, because this is one of those stories you don't forget. If it moves you even a little, hit like and subscribe, because there's a lot more where this came from. Daniel was 7 minutes late. 7 minutes. In most jobs, 7 minutes is nothing. You grab your coffee, you sit down, you apologize to no one, because no one even noticed. But at Ashcroft Global, under the leadership of CEO Victoria Ashcroft, 7 minutes was a war crime. Victoria had built her father's failing shipping company into a billion-dollar logistics empire through sheer, merciless discipline. She did not tolerate excuses. She did not tolerate softness. And she certainly did not tolerate a floor supervisor strolling in 7 minutes late on the day of the biggest client presentation of the quarter. Daniel hadn't meant to be late. His daughter, Mia, was 6 years old, and she had woken up that morning with a fever of 102 degrees, shaking, crying, clutching her stuffed rabbit and asking for her mother, a mother who had died 18 months earlier in a car accident that Daniel still replayed in his mind every single night before he fell asleep. There was no mother to call. There was no backup. There was only Daniel, a single father working 2 jobs to keep a roof over his daughter's head, standing in his tiny apartment kitchen at 6 in the morning, trying to get a fever down with a cold washcloth while simultaneously calling every daycare and every neighbor he knew, praying someone could take her for just a few hours. His elderly neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, finally agreed, but she lived 4 blocks away, and by the time Daniel had carried his sick daughter through the rain, given Mrs. Alvarez the emergency numbers, kissed Mia's burning forehead, and sprinted the 11 blocks to the office because the subway was delayed, 7 minutes had already slipped away like water through his fingers. He burst through the glass doors of the conference room, soaked, breathless, his heart hammering, just as Victoria Ashcroft was standing at the head of the table addressing the Kensington Group, the largest client the company had ever pursued. The room went silent. 12 executives in tailored suits turned to look at the man dripping rainwater onto the marble floor. Victoria didn't raise her voice. She never did. That was the terrifying part about her. She didn't need to. She simply looked at Daniel with those ice-blue eyes that had intimidated boardrooms across 3 continents, and said, in a tone so calm it was almost gentle, "Mr. Reyes, you're late." "I'm sorry, Ms. Ashcroft. My daughter was sick. I had to. I don't recall asking for an explanation." She turned back to the Kensington executives with a practiced, professional smile. "Please excuse the interruption." Then, without even looking at him again, she said the words that would end Daniel's career at Ashcroft Global. "Security will help you collect your things, Mr. Reyes. Today will be your last day." The room didn't gasp. Nobody dared. That was how much power Victoria Ashcroft held. A man's entire livelihood could be erased in a single sentence in front of a room full of strangers, and no one so much as flinched. Daniel stood there for a moment, water dripping from his hair onto his shoulders, feeling something crack quietly inside his chest. He wanted to explain. He wanted to tell her about Mia's fever, about her mother, about the 2 jobs, about how he had never once, in 3 years at that company, been late before this day. But he saw it in her eyes. She wasn't listening. She had already moved on. To her, this was simply a policy being enforced. He nodded once, turned, and walked out of the conference room with as much dignity as a man could hold on to, while his entire world quietly collapsed behind him. 2 security guards escorted him to his desk, watched him pack 18 months of his life into a single cardboard box, a photo of Mia at the beach, a chipped coffee mug that said, "World's okayest dad," that his late wife had bought him as a joke, a small drawing Mia had made of the two of them, standing in front of a house that didn't exist yet, a house he had promised her they would have one day. He carried the box down 32 floors in an elevator full of strangers who wouldn't meet his eyes, and stepped out into the pouring rain, jobless, with $412 in his bank account and a sick daughter waiting for him 4 blocks from an apartment where the rent was already 2 weeks late. He stood on the sidewalk outside, Ashcroft Global, for a long moment, rain soaking through the cardboard box, blurring the ink on Mia's drawing. And for the first time since his wife's funeral, Daniel Reyes let himself cry, right there on 5th Avenue, in front of 1,000 strangers who didn't care and never would. But someone did see him. Someone was waiting outside, and she had been standing under the awning of the coffee shop across the street for the last 20 minutes, watching the glass doors of Ashcroft Global with the kind of patience that comes from having absolutely nowhere else more important to be. Her name was Eleanor Ashcroft. She was 78 years old, and she was Victoria Ashcroft's grandmother, the woman who had actually founded the company, decades before Victoria was ever born, back when it was 3 trucks and a single warehouse in Newark. Eleanor had stepped down as chairwoman 15 years ago, handing the company first to her son and then, after his sudden death, to her granddaughter, Victoria. She rarely visited the office anymore, but today she had come because an old friend, a man who still worked in the mailroom, had called her the night before to say something was wrong, that the company Eleanor built with her bare hands had turned into something cold, something that ate good people alive, and called it discipline. Eleanor watched Daniel come out of those doors carrying a cardboard box, watched him stand in the rain and break down, and something in her chest, something that had been quietly disappointed in her granddaughter for a long time, finally decided to act. She crossed the street with her cane, ignoring her driver's protests, and walked straight up to Daniel Reyes. "Young man," she said, her voice carrying the same steel that had once negotiated shipping contracts with men twice her size. "You look like you've had a very bad morning." Daniel wiped his face quickly, embarrassed. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Don't apologize to me. Tell me what happened in there." And so he did. Standing on the sidewalk in the rain, a complete stranger asked him to explain himself, and unlike the woman inside the glass tower, this one actually listened. He told her about Mia's fever, about his late wife, about the frantic morning, about the 7 minutes, about 3 years of showing up early, staying late, never once complaining, and how none of it had mattered in the end. Eleanor listened to every word without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, watching the rain fall onto the box in his arms, onto the drawing of the house that didn't exist yet. "What's your daughter's name?" she asked. "Mia." "And where is she now?" "With a neighbor. I have to go get her. She's sick, and His voice cracked. "I don't know what I'm going to tell her. I don't know how I'm going to pay rent this month." Eleanor reached into her coat and pulled out a business card, pressing it into his hand. It was old, slightly yellowed, but the name on it was unmistakable. Eleanor Ashcroft, founder. "Go take care of your daughter," she said. "Call this number tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp. Not a minute later, not a minute earlier. And Mr. Reyes, do not worry about tonight's rent. Consider it handled." Before he could protest, she had already turned and walked back toward her car, leaving Daniel standing in the rain, utterly confused, holding a business card that felt heavier than the cardboard box in his other arm. That night, an envelope was slipped under Daniel's apartment door. Inside was enough cash to cover 2 months of rent and a note in careful, elegant handwriting. A good father should never have to choose between his child and his dignity. E.A. Daniel sat on the edge of Mia's bed that night, watching her fever finally break, watching her sleep peacefully for the first time all day. And he cried again, but this time it wasn't only from grief. It was something else, something that felt dangerously close to hope, a feeling he hadn't dared to let himself have since the accident. The next morning, at exactly 9 o'clock, Daniel called the number on the card. A calm assistant answered and told him to be at a private address in Tribeca by 10. It wasn't Ashcroft Global's glass tower. It was a quiet brownstone with ivy climbing the brick, and when Daniel knocked, Eleanor Ashcroft herself opened the door. "Come in, Mr. Reyes," she said. "We have a great deal to discuss." Inside, over a pot of tea neither of them touched, Eleanor told him something that changed the entire shape of the story. She was not simply a sympathetic old woman who happened to witness a stranger's misfortune. She had, in fact, been watching Ashcroft Global's culture deteriorate for over a year, receiving quiet complaints from longtime employees about Victoria's increasingly ruthless management style. People fired for taking sick days, for family emergencies, for the smallest human failings, all in the name of excellence. Eleanor had built that company on the principle that loyalty and compassion created the best results, not fear. She had watched her granddaughter forget that lesson somewhere along the way, buried under the pressure of proving herself in a world that told women they had to be twice as hard to be taken half as seriously. "I still hold a seat on the board," Eleanor explained. "A silent one, mostly, because I promised myself I would let Victoria run things her way. But silence has a cost, Mr. Reyes, and I think that cost has finally come due." She looked at him directly. "I want to offer you a position, not your old job, a new one. Director of Workforce Culture, reporting directly to the board, with the authority to review and reverse any termination you believe was unjust. Full salary, full benefits, and yes, full protection, so that Victoria cannot simply fire you again out of spite." Daniel was stunned into silence. "Why me?" Eleanor smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. "Because a man who runs 11 blocks in the rain to save 7 minutes for his sick daughter, and still finds it in himself to apologize to the people who fired him, understands something about responsibility that most executives in that building have long since forgotten. I don't need someone who's afraid of Victoria. I need someone who remembers what it means to actually care about people." He accepted, not fully understanding what he was walking into. Victoria Ashcroft found out about her grandmother's decision 3 days later. When Daniel Reyes walked back into the glass tower, not with a cardboard box, but with a company badge and a letter from the board of directors, she was furious. She stormed into Eleanor's Tribeca brownstone that same evening, demanding an explanation, accusing her grandmother of undermining her authority, of making her look weak in front of the entire company. "You hired the man I fired," Victoria said, pacing the room. "Do you understand what that does to my credibility?" Eleanor didn't raise her voice, the same trait she had passed down to her granddaughter without either of them ever quite realizing it. "Your credibility, Victoria, was never in question until you decided that credibility meant cruelty. That man was 7 minutes late because his motherless 6-year-old daughter had a fever of 102. He has never missed a day of work in 3 years, and you fired him in front of clients without asking a single question. The company runs on discipline. The company," Eleanor interrupted, sharper now, "was built on people, not policies. I built it with my hands, Victoria, in a Newark warehouse with 3 trucks and a lot of very tired, very loyal men and women who believed I had their backs, no matter what. That is the only reason this company survived its first 5 years. Not discipline, loyalty. You have discipline in abundance. What you're missing is loyalty, and I am terrified you will lose everything I built because you've forgotten the difference." Victoria stood there, arms crossed, jaw tight, ready to argue. But something in her grandmother's words landed somewhere deep, somewhere she'd been avoiding for a long time. She thought of her own father, Eleanor's son, who had died of a heart attack at his desk at 51 years old, having worked himself into the ground, trying to prove he deserved the empire he'd inherited. She thought of every relationship she'd sacrificed climbing this ladder, every birthday she'd missed of her own, every night she went home to an empty apartment because there was no one left in her life who hadn't grown tired of being second to Ashcroft Global. "I don't know how to be any other way," Victoria finally admitted, quietly, all the fight draining out of her voice. "If I'm not the hardest person in the room, I'm afraid I'll lose everything." Eleanor reached out and took her granddaughter's hand, something she hadn't done in years. "You already have lost something, my dear. You've lost the ability to see the people working beside you as human beings instead of numbers on a productivity report. That is far more dangerous than losing a client." Over the following weeks, something shifted inside Ashcroft Global, slowly, imperfectly, the way real change usually happens. Victoria did not transform overnight into a warm, forgiving leader. That would be a lie, and this story isn't interested in lying to you. But she started showing up to Daniel's office, at first out of suspicion, watching how he handled the dozens of cases that came across his desk. An employee who'd been reprimanded for leaving early to pick up a child from school. A warehouse worker denied bereavement leave after his father's death. A young analyst nearly fired for a medical emergency that wasn't her fault. Daniel handled each case not with softness for its own sake, but with the same discipline Victoria valued, paired with something she had lost: the ability to ask why before assuming the worst. Slowly, Victoria began sitting in on his meetings, listening, not agreeing at first, arguing constantly, testing him at every turn, the way she tested everyone. But Daniel never flinched from her, never groveled, never postured. He simply told her the truth every time, the same way he had on the sidewalk in the rain. And over time, that honesty began to matter to her more than she expected. 3 months later, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, Mia had another fever. Nothing serious. Just a childhood cold that came and went the way they do. Daniel called the office to explain he needed the morning off, bracing himself out of habit for the same cold response he'd once received. Instead, it was Victoria Ashcroft herself who answered his line, having taken over reception duties for 10 minutes while her assistant grabbed coffee. "Take the day, Mr. Reyes," she said. And there was something different in her voice now, something almost unfamiliar to her own ears. "Take tomorrow, too, if you need it. Family comes first. I should have understood that a long time ago." Daniel was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. "Thank you, Ms. Ashcroft." "Victoria," she corrected softly. "Just Victoria." By the end of that year, Ashcroft Global's employee retention had climbed for the first time in 5 years. And not because of a new incentive program or a corporate wellness initiative printed on a glossy pamphlet nobody read. It climbed because word spread quietly through break rooms and warehouse floors and late-night phone calls between coworkers that something had changed at the top. That the company finally had someone in leadership who remembered that behind every employee badge was a full human life. Bills to pay, children to raise, grief to carry, mornings that sometimes fell apart, no matter how hard you tried to hold them together. Eleanor Ashcroft passed away peacefully 18 months later, in her sleep, in the same Tribeca brownstone where she had once handed Daniel Reyes a business card in the pouring rain. At her funeral, Victoria stood at the podium, and instead of reading a polished corporate eulogy, she told the story of the day her grandmother taught her the most important lesson of her life. Not through a lecture, not through a boardroom confrontation, but by walking across a rainy street to help a stranger with a cardboard box and a sick daughter waiting at home. There was a season, somewhere in the middle of that first year when Daniel almost quit. Not because the work was hard, he had never been afraid of hard work, but because trust, once broken, doesn't rebuild itself in a straight line. There were mornings he walked into that glass tower and felt every old wound again. The silent stares of coworkers who remembered him being marched out with a cardboard box. The whispers that he was only there because an old woman felt sorry for him. The nagging fear that Victoria's newfound patience was temporary, a phase that would end the moment the pressure of the next big client returned. He carried Mia's small drawing of the house with the red door in his desk drawer during those weeks, not to dream about the future, but simply to remind himself why he was still showing up at all. It was Eleanor who noticed the change in him first. She invited him back to the Tribeca brownstone one evening, poured 2 cups of tea neither of them would finish, and asked him plainly whether he intended to stay. Daniel admitted, for the first time out loud, that he wasn't sure the company could really change, that maybe Victoria's kindness was only kindness toward him because it was convenient. A story she could tell herself about redemption without actually rebuilding the culture underneath it. Eleanor didn't argue with him. She simply said, "Culture doesn't change because one person decides to be kinder for a week, Mr. Reyes. It changes because someone refuses to leave when it would be easier to walk away. I'm not asking you to trust Victoria yet. I am asking you to give the people 2 floors below her, the ones who have no board seat, no grandmother watching over them, the chance that someone with real power might finally see them." That conversation stayed with him longer than almost anything else that year, and it was the reason he stayed through the difficult months that followed. The reason he kept showing up even when it would have been easier not to. Daniel Reyes still works at Ashcroft Global today, though his title has changed twice since that rainy morning. He now sits on the board himself, the same seat Eleanor once held quietly for decades. Mia, now 8 years old, keeps a drawing pinned above her desk at school. A little house with a red door, the same house her father promised her one day. A promise he finally kept 2 years after that terrible, wonderful morning when he lost everything and somehow, impossibly, found something better. And sometimes, late at night, when Daniel locks up his office and walks past the lobby of Ashcroft Global, he stops for a moment in front of the old black and white photograph hanging by the elevators. A young Eleanor Ashcroft standing in front of her very first delivery truck, chin raised, eyes fierce with the kind of hope that builds empires. And every single time, he says the same quiet thing to her photograph, the same 2 words he never got the chance to say to her in person before she passed. Thank you. Because sometimes the very worst morning of your life is actually the doorway to the very best chapter of it. You just have to survive long enough and stay decent enough to walk through it. And if this story reminded you of someone in your life who's fighting a quiet battle you can't see, do them a favor and check in on them today. If it moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a little hope tonight.